There's a thought most people avoid because it cuts too deep, too fast, that a lot of what gets called love isn't really love at all, but a quiet fear of being alone. That the urge to always have someone there isn't connection, it's distraction, and some relationships aren't built to bring you closer to yourself, but to keep you far enough away that you never have to face what's actually there. That discomfort you feel in silence, that restless pull to fill the space. It isn't random. It's the part of you that knows something real is waiting underneath it. The Stoics understood this in a way that still feels unsettling today. A person who cannot sit with themselves is already in chains, even if those chains feel comfortable. Because dependence doesn't always look like weakness. Sometimes it looks like attachment, like routine, like something you've convinced yourself you need. But the moment you remove the noise, the moment you stop reaching outward and start turning inward, something changes. You begin to see clearly. And that clarity doesn't arrive gently. It exposes what's been ignored. It reveals what's been avoided. But it also gives you something most people never reach, a chance to understand yourself without distortion. And once you see that, even briefly, it becomes difficult to go back to living the way you did before. It often begins so quietly that you almost miss it. A moment with no notifications, no conversation, no one else shaping your behavior, just stillness. And in that stillness, something unfamiliar starts to surface. Not the version of you that speaks or reacts, but the version underneath all of that. Unfiltered, unedited, unconcerned with expectations. At first, it doesn't feel like clarity. It feels like noise, thoughts overlapping, emotions rising without structure, fragments of things you've pushed aside slowly coming back into view. And because nothing interrupts it, it feels louder than it actually is. Most people never stay in that moment long enough to understand it. They move away from it. They reach for something, anything that restores distraction. But that instinct to escape is exactly what keeps things buried. Because what feels uncomfortable isn't the silence itself. It's what the silence reveals when nothing is covering it anymore. There's a reason the mind resists stillness. It isn't used to being seen this clearly. When there's space, it fills it, and not always in comfortable ways. It brings forward unresolved thoughts, lingering doubts, questions you've postponed for convenience. It exposes contradictions you've learned to ignore. And because these things don't have immediate answers, they create tension. But unfamiliar doesn't mean unnatural. It usually means unpracticed. The ability to sit with your own thoughts without reacting to them is something most people never develop. So instead, they stay busy, they stay occupied, they stay surrounded. Not because they want to, but because it's easier than facing what's waiting underneath. And over time, that avoidance becomes so normal that even a few minutes of silence feels overwhelming. Not because the mind is too heavy, but because it's finally being experienced without interruption. But if you stay with it, even briefly, something begins to shift. Not all at once, but gradually. The noise starts to organize itself. Thoughts separate. Patterns emerge. You begin to notice not just what you're thinking, but how you're thinking. And that awareness changes your position completely. You're no longer fully inside the experience, reacting to everything as it comes. You're observing it, understanding it, creating space between you and your immediate response. And that space is where clarity begins, not the kind that gives instant answers, but the kind that removes distortion. Without constant influence, without pressure to respond, without needing to maintain a version of yourself for someone else, you start seeing things as they actually are. And that kind of clarity is rare, because most people never give themselves the conditions to experience it. The Stoics saw this clearly. They didn't treat solitude as something to avoid, but as something to use. A place where the mind could be understood, not controlled. As Marcus Aurelius wrote, "Nowhere can man find a quieter or more untroubled retreat than in his own soul." That retreat isn't about escaping life. It's about stepping back from constant reaction long enough to actually see it. And once you begin to see clearly, something changes. You notice when you're reaching for distraction, when you're avoiding something instead of facing it, when you're choosing comfort over understanding. And that awareness doesn't judge you. It simply shows you what's happening. And for the first time, you have a choice. Not based on habit, not based on fear, but based on clarity. And from that point forward, everything starts to shift in subtle ways. You begin to realize how much of your life was shaped by avoiding yourself. How many decisions were made to stay comfortable rather than to stay honest. How often you chose noise over clarity simply because clarity required you to sit with things you didn't fully understand yet. But now, that space feels different. It's no longer something you're trying to escape. It's something you're learning from, something you're using. And in that process, you start building something that doesn't depend on constant distraction. A sense of direction that comes from within, not from what's happening around you. A sense of stability that doesn't collapse the moment things go quiet. And that changes how you move through everything else. And once you've experienced even a glimpse of that, it becomes difficult to go back. Not because you've figured everything out, but because you've seen what's possible when you stop running from yourself. You stop looking for something to fill the space. You stop expecting something external to fix what feels incomplete. Instead, you start building something that reflects you, something that holds even when nothing else is there to support it. And that's the shift most people never make. Not because it's impossible, but because it requires staying in the very place they've been trying to escape. But if you're still here, listening to this, then part of you already understands. And if you want to keep going deeper into that, to think more clearly, to understand yourself without distortion, to build something that actually feels like your own, then consider subscribing as a decision to stay connected to the version of you that refuses to live unconsciously. And that's where the real shift begins. Not in some dramatic realization, but in small, consistent moments where you choose to stay present with yourself instead of moving away. Where you allow thoughts to pass without immediately reacting to them. Where you listen without trying to silence what you hear. It's subtle, almost invisible from the outside, but internally it changes the foundation you're operating from. What once felt like emptiness starts to feel like space. What once felt overwhelming starts to feel manageable. And what once felt like something to escape from begins to feel like something you can actually learn from. Not because the thoughts themselves have changed, but because your relationship to them has. And in that shift, something important becomes clear. The silence was never the problem. It was the doorway. Because the truth is, most people don't walk into relationships with a clear understanding of themselves. They walk in carrying questions they haven't answered, feelings they haven't processed, and uncertainties they haven't fully faced. It doesn't look like avoidance from the outside. It looks like connection, like effort, like emotional investment. But underneath it, there's often something else driving it. A quiet need to fill space. A subtle desire to not feel alone with your own thoughts for too long. And that's where things begin to blur. Because when connection becomes a way to escape rather than a way to share, it changes the entire foundation it's built on. It happens gradually. You don't consciously decide to avoid yourself. You just start prioritizing what feels easier. It's easier to focus on someone else's day than to reflect on your own direction. Easier to engage in constant conversation than to sit in silence and face questions that don't have immediate answers. Easier to stay occupied in shared routines than to explore what you actually want outside of them. And over time, that ease becomes a pattern where your attention is always directed outward, where your sense of stability starts depending on something beyond you, where your inner world becomes secondary to whatever is happening in the relationship. At first, it doesn't feel like a loss. It feels like closeness, like you're building something meaningful, and in many ways you are. But when that connection is layered on top of unresolved parts of yourself, it starts to carry more than it was meant to. It becomes responsible not just for companionship, but for distraction. Not just for support, but for stability. And that's where things begin to shift in a way that most people don't immediately notice. Because when a relationship starts holding the weight of everything you haven't addressed internally, it stops being just about the other person. It becomes a structure you rely on to avoid facing yourself directly. That's why stepping away from that constant external focus can feel so intense. When the interaction slows down, when the presence isn't there in the same way, when you're no longer adjusting your attention around someone else, something unexpected happens. The space that's left behind doesn't stay empty for long. It fills with everything that was previously pushed aside. Thoughts you didn't have time to fully consider. Feelings you softened or ignored to keep things smooth. Questions about your direction, your identity, your choices. They don't appear suddenly. They've always been there. You just didn't have the space to notice them clearly. And that realization can be uncomfortable, not because there's something wrong with you, but because there's something real that hasn't been explored yet. Without the constant exchange of energy that comes with connection, your mind begins to turn inward in a way that feels unfamiliar. You're no longer reacting as much, you're observing more. And observation brings clarity, but it also brings responsibility, because once you see something clearly, it becomes harder to ignore it. Once you recognize a pattern, it becomes difficult to pretend it's not there. This is where many people rush to fill the space again, not out of weakness, but out of habit. Because facing yourself requires a kind of patience that most people haven't practiced. It requires sitting with uncertainty without immediately trying to resolve it. It requires allowing thoughts to exist without needing to distract yourself from them. And that process doesn't feel productive at first. It feels slow. It feels unclear. It feels like you're not moving forward in any obvious way. But internally, something is shifting. The parts of you that were overshadowed by constant interaction are starting to come into focus. There's a difference between being alone and being with yourself, and most people haven't experienced the second one fully. Being alone can feel like absence if you're used to filling every moment with something external, but being with yourself is something else entirely. It's an active process, one where you begin to understand how you think, how you react, what you avoid, what you value, and that understanding doesn't come from distraction. It comes from presence, from allowing space to exist without immediately trying to change it. Over time, that space becomes less intimidating, not because everything inside it is resolved, but because you become more familiar with it. You start to recognize that the discomfort you felt wasn't a signal to escape, but an invitation to pay attention. And that shift in perspective changes how you approach both solitude and connection. You're no longer seeking connection to avoid yourself. You're choosing it from a place where you already understand what you bring into it. Carl Jung captured this in a way that still holds weight when he said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." What most people experience as patterns in relationships, recurring frustrations, repeated outcomes, often comes from things they haven't fully examined within themselves. And when those things remain unexamined, they don't disappear. They simply show up in different forms, influencing choices without being fully understood. So when the external focus is removed, what remains isn't emptiness, it's awareness. It's everything that was waiting beneath the surface, not to overwhelm you, but to be understood. And while that process isn't always comfortable, it's necessary. Because without it, connection becomes a cycle of repetition rather than a space for growth. But with it, something changes. You stop using relationships to escape yourself, and you start approaching them as something that can actually reflect who you've become. And this is where something subtle but powerful begins to change. Not all at once, not in some dramatic moment, but in small decisions that start to feel different. Without someone else constantly shaping your choices, your attention naturally begins to turn inward. You notice it in the way you think through simple things: what to do with your time, what you actually enjoy, what feels right without needing to explain it. At first it might feel unfamiliar, even a little uncertain, because you're not used to making decisions without considering how they'll be received. But that uncertainty isn't confusion, it's space. Space that was always there, just never fully yours. When you're used to sharing your life closely with someone, even the smallest decisions can become collaborative without you realizing it. You adjust your timing, your preferences, your reactions, not always consciously, but consistently. Over time, that adjustment becomes automatic. You begin to think in terms of we before fully understanding what I actually wants. And while that can create harmony, it can also blur something important. Because when your internal direction is constantly aligned with someone else's expectations, your own voice becomes quieter. Not gone, just harder to hear. So when that external influence is no longer present in the same way, your mind starts recalibrating. It's like removing a constant background noise you didn't even realize was there. At first, the silence feels unusual, but then gradually it becomes clearer. You start noticing the difference between what you genuinely prefer and what you've adapted to. You begin recognizing the choices you made out of habit versus the ones that actually reflect who you are. And that awareness creates a shift, not just in what you do, but in how you relate to your own decisions. There's a kind of freedom in that process that doesn't feel loud or obvious. It's quiet, steady. It shows up in moments where you realize you're not hesitating in the same way. You're not running through scenarios in your head, anticipating reactions, adjusting your thoughts before they're even fully formed. You're just deciding, acting, experiencing. And while that might seem simple, it's something many people rarely experience fully. Because most decisions are filtered through layers of consideration that have nothing to do with the decision itself, but everything to do with how it will be perceived. The Stoics understood this in a way that still feels deeply relevant. They believed that freedom isn't about having endless options, but about not being controlled by what lies outside of you. And there's very little more outside of your control than another person's emotions, expectations, or reactions. When your sense of direction depends on those things, even subtly, your freedom becomes limited in ways that are easy to overlook. You might still feel independent on the surface, but internally there's a constant negotiation happening, a quiet adjustment that shapes your behavior without you fully noticing it. When that dependency begins to fade, something shifts internally. You start to feel a different kind of stability. Not the kind that comes from consistency in your environment, but the kind that comes from consistency within yourself. You're no longer relying on external cues to guide your decisions. You're not waiting for validation to confirm what you already feel. You're not holding back just to maintain a certain balance. Instead, your actions start aligning more directly with your own understanding. And that alignment creates a sense of clarity that doesn't need constant reinforcement. It's not that you stop caring about others or become detached. It's that your decisions are no longer anchored in their presence. You're not choosing based on what will keep things smooth or predictable. You're choosing based on what feels true to you. And that shift changes the entire experience of being alone. It stops feeling like something temporary or incomplete and starts feeling like something intentional. Something you're using rather than something you're waiting to move past. Of course, this doesn't mean every decision becomes easy. In fact, some of them become more difficult because now you're fully responsible for them. There's no one else to share the weight with, no one else to lean on when things feel uncertain. But that responsibility is also what strengthens your sense of direction, because each choice you make comes directly from you, not from a compromise, not from an adjustment, not from an expectation. And over time, that builds something deeper than confidence. It builds trust in yourself. Epictetus expressed this idea simply when he said, No man is free who is not master of himself. That mastery isn't about control in a rigid sense. It's about understanding, knowing what influences you, what drives you, what shapes your decisions. And when you're constantly adapting to someone else's presence, that understanding can become blurred. But when you have space to observe yourself clearly, without that constant adjustment, you begin to see those influences more directly, and once you see them, you have a choice. You can continue operating the same way, or you can start responding differently, not out of pressure, but out of awareness. You can begin to align your actions with what you actually value, not what feels easiest in the moment. And that alignment doesn't happen all at once. It builds gradually through small decisions that reinforce your independence rather than dilute it. What emerges from that process isn't isolation, it's clarity, a clearer understanding of what matters to you, what direction you want to move in, what kind of life you're actually building, and that clarity becomes the foundation for everything that follows. Because once your sense of direction comes from within rather than from external influence, it becomes far more stable, less reactive, less dependent, more intentional. And in that intention, something important becomes clear. You're not just navigating your life, you're shaping it, not based on what fits into someone else's expectations, but based on what genuinely aligns with who you are. And that shift, even if it feels small at first, changes the entire way you move forward. But that independence doesn't come without resistance. It would be easier if clarity instantly replaced doubt, if once you started choosing yourself, everything felt stable and certain. But that's not how it works. There's a part of you that pulls back, quietly at first, then more noticeably. It reminds you of what felt familiar, the routines, the shared experiences, the sense of having someone there. Even if those things weren't fully aligned with who you are now, they carried a kind of comfort. And comfort has a way of disguising itself as something essential. It makes you question whether stepping away from it was a mistake, even when you know somewhere deeper that it wasn't. That pull toward familiarity isn't random. It's shaped over time, reinforced by repetition, strengthened by emotion. The more something becomes part of your routine, the more your mind associates it with stability. And when that routine changes, even for the better, it can feel like something important is missing. Not because it truly is, but because your system hasn't adjusted yet. It's still expecting what used to be there. It's still operating on patterns that haven't caught up to your current reality. And in that gap between what was and what is, doubt begins to surface. It doesn't always come in obvious ways. Sometimes it's subtle. A passing thought that you're falling behind. A comparison you didn't intend to make. A moment where you question whether this path is sustainable long-term. And those thoughts can feel convincing, not because they're true, but because they're familiar. They echo what you've heard, what you've seen, what you've been taught to believe about what a complete life should look like. And when something inside you starts moving in a different direction, those old beliefs don't just disappear. They push back. You start to notice how deeply certain ideas have been ingrained. That being with someone means progress. That being alone means something is missing. That time spent without a partner is time spent waiting. These ideas don't always come from a single source. They build gradually through culture, through observation, through subtle reinforcement over years. And because they're so widely accepted, they rarely get questioned. They just become the background assumption that shapes how you interpret your own life. But then there are moments that don't quite fit that narrative, moments where you're alone, and instead of feeling incomplete, you feel clear. Where there's no pressure to adjust, no need to respond, no expectation to be anything other than what you are in that moment. And in those moments, something feels different. Not louder, not more exciting, but more real, more grounded, less filtered, and it creates a kind of contrast that's hard to ignore. Because if being alone was truly equivalent to lacking something, those moments wouldn't exist. That contrast is where the resistance begins to lose its certainty. You start to see that the discomfort isn't coming from the state of being alone itself, but from the conflict between what you've been taught to believe and what you're actually experiencing. One part of you is operating on inherited ideas, while another part is responding to direct experience. And those two don't always align. The mind tends to favor what it already knows, even if that knowledge is incomplete. But experience has a way of slowly reshaping those beliefs, not through force, but through repetition. As you continue in that space, something shifts. The questions don't disappear, but they change in tone. They become less about whether you're missing out and more about what you're actually gaining, less about how this looks from the outside and more about how it feels from the inside. And that shift isn't dramatic. It happens gradually, through repeated moments of clarity that begin to outweigh the initial discomfort. You start trusting your own experience more than the assumptions you've carried for years. Still, the resistance doesn't vanish completely. It shows up in different forms, sometimes as nostalgia, sometimes as comparison, sometimes as a quiet urge to return to what's known simply because it's easier to understand. But now there's a difference. You can see it for what it is. You can recognize that the pull isn't always aligned with what's best for you, but with what feels familiar. And that awareness creates space between the feeling and your response to it. And once you see that, even briefly, the hold those expectations have starts to weaken. You realize that the path you're on doesn't need to match a predefined structure to be valid. It doesn't need to follow a sequence that others recognize. It only needs to make sense to you from where you stand now with what you understand now. And that realization doesn't eliminate resistance, but it changes how you relate to it. Instead of reacting to it immediately, you begin to observe it. You notice when it appears, what triggers it, how it tries to pull you back towards something familiar. And in that observation, you gain a kind of control that isn't forceful, but intentional. You're no longer being moved by every passing doubt. You're choosing how to respond to it. What remains is something quieter, but stronger. A growing understanding that what feels unfamiliar isn't necessarily wrong, and what feels familiar isn't always aligned. And in that understanding, the resistance loses its authority. It becomes just another part of the process, not something that defines it. In those quieter moments, something else begins to come into focus. Not all at once, but gradually, like a reflection becoming clearer the longer you look at it. You start to notice how much of who you thought you were was shaped in response to someone else. The way you spoke, the way you reacted, even the things you claimed to prefer. None of it felt forced at the time. It felt natural, like you were simply adapting, being considerate, being part of something shared. And in many ways you were. But adaptation, when repeated enough, begins to blur into identity. What starts as adjustment slowly becomes who you believe you are. It doesn't happen in obvious ways. It's rarely a moment where you consciously decide to change yourself. It's a series of small choices. You soften an opinion here, delay a reaction there, choose something familiar over something you actually want because it keeps things smooth. Each choice feels minor, reasonable, even mature. And because there's no immediate consequence, you don't question it. In fact, it often feels like the right thing to do, like you're growing, becoming more flexible, more understanding. But what isn't immediately visible is the accumulation of those choices over time. Over time, that version of you becomes easier to carry. It's predictable, adaptable, aligned with what's expected, but it's also slightly removed from what's real. Not completely, but enough that something feels different when you step outside of that dynamic. When you're no longer in that environment, no longer adjusting in the same way, you begin to notice the gap. The difference between how you were showing up and how you actually feel when there's no one else to respond to. And that difference can be surprising, even disorienting at first. Because now, without that constant feedback loop, you're left with something more direct. You don't have to anticipate reactions. You don't have to adjust your tone. You don't have to align your preferences with someone else's expectations. And in that absence of adjustment, your natural responses begin to surface again. The opinions you held back, the interests you set aside, the ways of thinking that didn't quite fit into the dynamic you were part of. They don't return all at once. They reappear gradually as you give yourself space to exist without filtering. This is where things can feel unfamiliar because you're no longer operating from a version of yourself that was shaped through constant interaction. You're reconnecting with something that hasn't been fully expressed for a while, and that process isn't always smooth. There's a period where you're not entirely sure what feels right, because you're distinguishing between what was adapted and what is actually yours. But that uncertainty is part of the process. It's the space where clarity begins to form, not from external validation, but from direct experience. What becomes clear over time is that much of what you thought was you was actually a response to maintain connection, to keep things balanced, to avoid disruption. And while those responses served a purpose, they weren't always aligned with your deeper preferences or values. They were functional, not necessarily authentic. And when you step out of that pattern, even temporarily, you begin to see that difference more clearly. Carl Jung once said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." That process isn't about adding something new. It's about removing what was never fully yours to begin with. The layers of adaptation, expectation, and adjustment that built up over time. And being single in this context creates the conditions for that process to unfold. Not because being alone is inherently transformative, but because it removes the constant influence that was shaping your behavior without you fully noticing it. As that influence fades, your sense of self begins to reorganize. You start making choices that aren't based on maintaining a dynamic, but on what actually resonates with you. You begin expressing thoughts without filtering them through someone else's expectations. You notice what energizes you, what feels aligned, what doesn't. And that awareness builds gradually through repeated moments where you choose to respond based on your own understanding rather than habit. Over time, the version of you that felt easier to maintain begins to feel less necessary, not because it was wrong, but because it was incomplete. It was shaped by context, by interaction, by the need to fit into something shared. And while there's value in that, there's also value in understanding who you are outside of it. Without the constant editing, without the anticipation, without the need to align every part of yourself with someone else's expectations. What remains is something quieter, but more stable, a version of you that doesn't require constant adjustment to exist. One that isn't built around maintaining something external, but around understanding something internal. And while that version may take time to fully recognize, it becomes clearer the more space you give it to exist without interference. And in that clarity, something shifts. You're no longer trying to maintain an identity, you're discovering one. That's when something changes in a way that's hard to explain at first, but impossible to ignore once you feel it. Solitude stops feeling like something you're stuck in and starts feeling like something you're actively using. The same silence that once felt heavy begins to feel open, not empty, but available. Your thoughts don't disappear, but they become easier to follow. There's less noise around them, less interruption, less pressure to respond immediately, and because of that, you start seeing them more clearly. Not just what you think, but how you think. Not just what you feel, but where those feelings come from. It's not that life suddenly becomes simple. In many ways, it becomes more honest. You can't rely on distraction in the same way. You can't redirect your attention outward every time something feels uncomfortable, but instead of reacting to that discomfort, you begin to sit with it, to observe it without immediately trying to change it. And that shift from reacting to observing is where something deeper starts to take shape. because when you're constantly reacting, you're always slightly behind your own experience. But when you're observing, you're present with it. That presence creates space, and in that space, your decisions begin to change, not because you're forcing yourself to act differently, but because you're seeing more clearly what's actually happening. You notice patterns that used to go unnoticed. You catch yourself before falling into habits that once felt automatic. You start asking different questions, not out of confusion, but out of curiosity. And those questions don't always need immediate answers. Sometimes just asking them is enough to shift how you think. This is where growth stops being something abstract and starts becoming something real. It's no longer about concepts or ideas you've heard before. It's about how you're actually living, how you're thinking, how you're responding to what happens internally, not just externally. And that kind of growth doesn't happen quickly. It builds over time, through consistent attention, through repeated moments where you choose to stay present instead of drifting back into distraction. There's also a different kind of discipline that starts to develop here. Not the kind that comes from forcing yourself into routines, but the kind that comes from understanding why you do what you do. When you're observing your own patterns, you begin to see what leads to certain outcomes, what supports your clarity and what disrupts it. And that awareness naturally influences your behavior. You start making choices that align with what you've seen, not because you have to, but because it makes sense. Epictetus once said, "First say to yourself what you would be, and then do what you have to do." That process isn't about creating an identity out of nothing. It's about recognizing what's already there when everything unnecessary is removed. And solitude, when used intentionally, becomes the space where that recognition happens. You're no longer distracted by what you think you should be. You're observing what you already are and deciding what to build from there. As that understanding grows, your relationship with time changes. You're not trying to fill it in the same way. You're not measuring it by how much is happening externally. You start to value depth over constant activity. A single hour spent thinking clearly can feel more meaningful than an entire day spent reacting to things without reflection. And that shift in how you experience time changes how you approach your life as a whole. It doesn't mean you stop valuing connection. It means your relationship to it changes. You're no longer seeking it as a way to fill space or avoid something internal. You're approaching it from a place where your attention is already grounded, where your sense of direction isn't dependent on someone else's presence. And that makes any connection you do choose more intentional, more aligned, more stable. But even beyond that, something else becomes clear. That the space you once tried to escape is the same space that allows everything else to grow. The clarity, the focus, the understanding, the direction, it all comes from that same place. Not from adding more, but from removing what was getting in the way. And once you've experienced that, even briefly, it becomes difficult to ignore. Because you realize that solitude was never just about being alone. It was about having the space to become fully present with yourself. And from that presence, everything else begins to take shape in a way that actually reflects who you are. And from that place, something else begins to shift, almost without you noticing it at first. The way you understand connection starts to change, not in a dramatic or forced way, but naturally, as a result of everything you've already experienced. The urgency that once surrounded relationships begins to fade. That quiet pressure to fill space, to not be alone for too long, to always have someone there, starts to lose its grip. And in its place, something steadier begins to form. A sense that connection is no longer something you need in order to feel complete, but something you can choose when it truly aligns. It's a subtle difference, but it changes everything. Before, connection might have felt like something essential, something that defined your sense of stability. Without it, things felt uncertain, incomplete, like something was missing. But now, that feeling isn't there in the same way. Not because you've rejected connection, but because you've experienced what it feels like to stand on your own without losing yourself. You've seen that your sense of direction doesn't disappear when no one else is there to reflect it back to you. And once you've experienced that, even briefly, it becomes something you carry with you. That shift removes a kind of pressure that most people don't even realize they're living under. The pressure to make things work, to hold on to something just because it exists, to avoid endings even when they no longer feel right. Without that pressure, your decisions begin to change. You're no longer choosing based on what keeps you from being alone. You're choosing based on what actually fits, what actually feels aligned with who you are now, not who you were when you first entered that connection. And that alignment becomes easier to recognize because you're no longer filtering everything through fear. Fear of losing someone, fear of starting over, fear of facing silence again. Those fears don't disappear completely, but they don't control your decisions in the same way. You've already faced the silence. You've already experienced what it's like to sit with yourself without distraction, and because of that, the idea of being alone doesn't carry the same weight. It's no longer something you're trying to avoid at all costs. This creates a different kind of clarity. You start to see relationships for what they are, not for what they promise to fix. You're not looking for someone to stabilize you, to complete you, to give you a sense of direction. You already have that. Instead, you're looking for something that adds to it, something that complements what you've built within yourself rather than something that replaces it. And that distinction changes how you approach everything, from who you connect with to how you maintain those connections. There's also a shift in how you respond to misalignment. Before, you might have tolerated things longer than you should have, not because you didn't see them, but because leaving felt like a loss of stability. But now, that fear isn't as strong. You know that your stability doesn't depend on the relationship itself. And because of that, you're more willing to step away from what doesn't feel right. Not out of detachment, but out of respect for yourself. Out of an understanding that holding on to something misaligned costs more than letting it go. From this place, you begin to approach connection with a different mindset. You're not trying to make something work at all costs. You're not adjusting yourself to fit into something that doesn't align. You're observing, understanding, allowing things to unfold without forcing them into a specific outcome. And that patience creates space for something more genuine to develop. Something that isn't built on urgency or fear, but on mutual clarity. There's also a kind of calm that comes with this shift. You're not constantly evaluating where you stand, not constantly seeking reassurance, not constantly adjusting your behavior to maintain a certain dynamic. You're present, you're engaged, but you're also grounded in yourself. And that grounding changes how you experience connection in a way that's difficult to replicate when you're operating from a place of need. Over time, this becomes your default way of relating, not just in romantic connections, but in all forms of interaction. You're no longer seeking something to complete you. You're sharing what's already there, and that changes the energy of every interaction. It becomes less about filling space and more about expanding it. And in that shift, something becomes clear. Connection was never meant to replace your relationship with yourself. It was meant to exist alongside it. And once that balance is in place, everything else begins to feel more aligned, more intentional, and far more real. Which leads to a realization that doesn't arrive all at once, but settles in slowly, almost quietly, until one day it feels obvious. Being single was never the problem. It only felt like one because of how it was framed, because of what you were taught to believe it meant, that it was temporary, incomplete, something to move past as quickly as possible. But when you begin to see it differently, when you stop measuring it against expectations that were never fully yours, the entire experience changes. What once felt like something missing begins to feel like something available. That shift in perspective isn't just mental. It changes how you experience your time, your thoughts, your decisions. The silence that once felt uncomfortable begins to reveal things you couldn't hear before. Not because they weren't there, but because there was always something louder covering them. And once that noise fades, even slightly, you begin to notice what's underneath. Patterns in your thinking, motivations behind your actions. The difference between what you've been doing and what you actually want to be doing. And while that awareness can feel intense at first, it's also where clarity begins. What used to feel like absence starts to feel like space. Not empty space, but open space. Space where your thoughts aren't constantly interrupted, where your attention isn't divided, where your decisions aren't shaped by the need to maintain something external, and in that space, something begins to build. Not quickly, not all at once, but steadily. A sense of direction that isn't borrowed, a sense of stability that isn't dependent, a sense of identity that isn't constantly adjusted to fit into something else. This is where solitude becomes something entirely different from what you once thought it was. It's no longer a waiting period. It's no longer something you tolerate until something better comes along. It becomes a place where you actually develop, where you understand yourself in a way that isn't influenced by constant interaction, where you begin to see what you're capable of when your attention is fully your own, and that understanding changes what you look for moving forward. Because once you've experienced that level of clarity, even briefly, you stop searching for something to fix you. You stop looking at connection as a solution to an internal problem. You start recognizing that what you were looking for externally was something that had to be built internally first. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough that you're no longer dependent on someone else to feel whole. And that changes the way you move through everything. Your decisions become more intentional. Your standards become clearer. Your boundaries become more defined. Not because you're trying to control your life more tightly, but because you understand it more deeply. You know what aligns and what doesn't, what supports your growth and what disrupts it. And that understanding allows you to move with more certainty, even when things are still uncertain. There's also a shift in how you relate to discomfort. Before, it might have felt like something to avoid, something that signaled you were doing something wrong. But now, it feels different. It feels like part of the process, like something that comes with growth, not something that stands in the way of it. And because you've learned to sit with yourself without immediately escaping, that discomfort loses some of its intensity. It becomes something you can observe rather than something you have to react to. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this and you will find strength." That strength doesn't come from controlling everything around you. It comes from understanding how you respond to it. From recognizing that your sense of stability isn't determined by what happens externally, but by how grounded you are internally. And solitude, when approached with that perspective, becomes one of the clearest ways to develop that grounding. Over time, what felt uncertain begins to feel intentional. You're no longer waiting for something to change so you can feel complete. You're building something that already reflects who you are. And that process isn't always visible from the outside. It doesn't follow a timeline that others recognize, but internally, it's steady, it's consistent, it's real. You start to notice that your sense of self isn't shifting as easily, that your decisions aren't as reactive, that your direction feels more stable, even when the external circumstances change. And that stability doesn't come from having everything figured out. It comes from knowing that you can navigate uncertainty without losing yourself in it. And that's what turns solitude from something temporary into something powerful. Not because it lasts forever, but because of what it builds while it's there. It gives you the space to understand yourself without interference, to develop clarity without pressure, to create a foundation that isn't dependent on anything outside of you. So when you do choose connection again, it's different. Not because the connection itself has changed, but because you have. You're no longer entering it from a place of need. You're entering it from a place of understanding. And that difference shapes everything that follows, because in the end, it was never about being single or not. It was about whether you knew how to be with yourself. And once you learn that, everything else becomes a choice, not a necessity. In the end, nothing you were searching for was ever missing. It was just buried under noise, distraction, and the constant need to look outward. And the moment you learn to stand fully on your own, without needing to escape yourself, everything changes. Not because the world becomes easier, but because you finally become steady within it. If this spoke to something real in you, there's another video on your screen that will take you even deeper into this path. Stay with it. And thank you for being a part of Stoic Journal.